Okay everyone, welcome back. So we put together a little video today for you guys because it's prime buying season. You guys are all keen to go out and try all the new products, and we always feel like it's our job to arm you with the best information that we possibly can to help you make the best decisions. Yeah. So today we wanted to address picking the right loft. What does the right loft look like? What does a driver with too low loft look like? What is a driver that has too much loft? What does that look like? So we had Matt do a little bit of testing, and we were able to get some really interesting numbers, and you know, we can really obviously show you what the repercussions are of using a misplaced loft.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
So let's run through them a little bit here. So we've got we tested an 8.5, a 10.5, and a 12. So the kind of give a bit of a different spectrum between the three drivers. So we started out with 8.5, and as we would expect, the lowest spinning, the lowest launching driver of the bunch. Okay,
100%
so
it was, yeah.
sometimes it's my perception that people, in a bid to get this kind of low spin, you know, high ball speed scenario, they go too low in loft often. So that was the case.
Yeah, so that's kind of how we started the chat. Was a ton of people are saying, let's go as low as we can in loft, get a shaft that gets you enough launch, and then just have, you know, as little backspin as possible. So obviously people are going too far the other way because they're starting to lose control. They're hitting these knuckleballs like what we saw on the screen, and they're not going out on the golf course with like a playable shot. So that was a perfect example of that. And then I guess the rest of the test was to say, okay, how much loft, given we use the same head, like how much loft is necessary to kind of stabilize that flight, and why is it better to have a little more spin, and, you know, based on this ball speed.
For sure.
That's what we were looking for.
Yeah, and we could see the ball speed didn't really fluctuate too much between between all of them, and we're going to actually show you the impact location in all three, and we can show you it's really quite tight and all very consistent. So really what the biggest difference we're seeing, because we kept the shaft the same the whole way through, we're seeing the difference is just in delivered loft. Okay, so we saw 11.3 launch, 1700 spin at 150 miles an hour ball speed. That's not enough. Okay, that's going to be too low. It's going to pitch it too low, and as it turned out, it actually I think the average peak height was 66 feet.
Yeah, it was something like that.
Okay.
It was way too low.
Way too low. So you can see that even there from the red trajectory that we've got. We've got all three trajectories up there. So quite an interesting difference between the three flights. The red was extremely low. The 10.5 and the 12 weren't all that different in the peak height.
No, they weren't. And they were, well, you would say, optimizing a driver, those two were at least reasonably close, and the 8.5 was just completely wrong.
Too low in the launch. So you can see the launch is quite similar in the 12 and the 10.5. The biggest difference was in the spin rates.
Yeah, big time.
And what we actually saw, so you can see when the ball hits its peak, it hits its apex around the same with both. It's actually the last third of the golf ball's journey, the angle of descent, that's where they were different, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I noticed when I was hitting the shots, like I hit a few and I thought the 12 degree might have actually hit a similar length as some of the 10.5, and then it just kind of just dropped out of the air very sharply, you know, sort of floated and then dropped. And that's where those last 5-10 yards, they just weren't showing up, and that's exactly what we're seeing right there.
Exactly. So this is the ideal scenario where you would say, okay, this is what a driver with this has too low launch does. The driver with low loft, what that basically does is it can yield a very long drive, but it can also yield a really short drive as well. If you get that spin rate too low, like we saw with some of those drives, Matt, the carry distance would just plummet.
It did, and especially if I mishit it a bit, if I hit it a bit high on the face or on the toe, like those shots weren't even usable. 100%. Whereas if I towed the 10.5 or the 12 a bit, yes, they were a bit of a, you know, a hooker or whatever you want to call it, but they were a usable, playable shot on the golf course, right?
And that backspin, we actually really use backspin for stability in the ball flight. So when that spin rate gets too low, the spin axis can become so violent that it creates such a aggressive curvature.
Gotcha.
That's when you really start to shape the ball offline, and those penalty shots can occur. So there's a point where backspin has to be low enough to get optimum distance, but it has to be high enough to gain maximum stability on the ball flight.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I think that's what we saw with the 10.5.
Yeah, so when we started the test, we thought, okay, we're going to hit some shots to try to get that 150 ball speed range, which luckily today I was able to do. And what, that's a pretty typical player, maybe a little faster than average, you'd say, like 145 is probably a little more average. But
yeah, right now 145 is what we're basically saying that the average male will swing a drive, or the output on a driver will be.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe this is a little faster, but we're not talking, 50 yards difference or anything.
No, close.
But, so perfect example, an average player, they can't be spinning at 1800. They can't likely be in an 8.5. Can you picture a situation where I've got 150 ball speed and a fairly consistent swing? What would it take, for me to even get that? Would I have to be hitting down on it so much that I'd spin it, to get a decent ball flight out of it? Is that the conditions that would even make that viable?
If for the 1800, do you know what it comes down to? The premium becomes on the club face.
Gotcha. So
it's okay to have high launch, low spin. I mean, we all probably remember the TaylorMade campaign a few years ago, the Loft Up campaign. So this SLDR head was designed to use more loft to get the ball up in the air because the driver had such a low spin DNA that you were able to get massive amounts of distance. Well, the other part of that driver was it was horrible from an MOI standpoint.
Right.
So toe and heel strikes would be very, very unforgiving. So that's where we see drivers nowadays. You look at Rogue this year, look at G400 Max. There's a big MOI movement going on just now. So a lot of companies are going, well, we found out how to make drivers fast. Now we're finding out how to make them fast and forgiving.
Right. Which is really the ideal situation. And when I hit that 8.5, as you said, like those toe and heel and high strikes, they felt awful, and the shots were awful. Like they would be kind of your bad memories from a round of golf. Whereas again, with the higher lofted ones, they were playable. I probably wouldn't have hit it out of bounds or anything. At least you can play the hole. So is that the biggest difference? I mean, obviously the backspin, it's a knuckleball, it's not a great flight, but would you say that it's going to affect your score really negatively to have way too little loft? If you go out there with way too much loft, yes, you're sacrificing distance, but you're probably not going to go and hit 5 balls out of bounds and all this kind of stuff.
Well, for me, the player who starts to see those numbers, 11 degree of launch and 1700 spin on 150 miles an hour ball speed, that player at some point will realize that ball flight's too low.
Gotcha.
They will start to artificially create launch and start to change their swing.
Change my swing, yeah.
Exactly. So then the inconsistencies creep in, and
even worse.
It just breeds inconsistency to the game. So rather than having that scenario where you feel like you make the swing that comes most naturally to you and the resulting ball flight is balanced.
That's really the key to it, is it's
100%.
having the comfort to just swing, a consistent swing that you've been working on and not have to manipulate it because you bought an 8-degree driver because you thought it was right and it just wasn't right.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I've probably touched on this a little bit, but really, guys, the key to this whole thing is to achieve the right balance between the dynamic loft of your driver, so dynamic loft being the amount of delivered loft at impact. So some people have the handle, the shaft leaning back and add more loft. Some people lean the shaft a little more forward, take loft away. So the difference between that dynamic loft and your angle of attack in our club fitting world is, and in the measurement, in the sort of ball flight measurement world, is called spin loft. So having the right spin loft is the absolute key to getting the right balance of launch and spin.
Gotcha.
So if you are, for example, 2 degrees up in your angle of attack, a really nice place to be. I know some of you have touched on sort of what's an optimal
too much?
angle of attack. So around 2 degrees upright's a really nice spot to be. If your dynamic loft is around 14, we basically take the difference. So we've got the 14 degrees dynamic loft, subtract the 2 degrees of angle of attack, so we'll get 12 degrees of dynamic loft.
Gotcha.
If we are -1 degree of angle of attack and 15 degrees of dynamic loft, the difference is 16.
Gotcha.
So that's how we calculate spin loft for the most part. Face angle and club path can change it a little bit, but decimal points. The biggest thing is angle of attack versus dynamic loft to create that spin loft window.
Gotcha.
That's the most important thing, Matt. So when we're picking a head and a shaft combo with whatever loft, that's what we have in our mind.
Yeah, so that was my next question, was this kind of illustrates how important the loft of a driver is. Like obviously, the heads vary with their design. Some are lower spin, higher launch naturally.
Yep.
But would you agree that there's not a whole lot that's going to make as much a difference as, you know, a 1 or 2 degree loft change on a driver? Like that's got to be one of the top things you can alter.
Absolutely, no question at all. You've got to make sure that you're choosing that right loft. Make sure it's the right loft for the type of swing you have.
Yeah, for that spin loft.
To get that spin loft window right in the proper place, and you know, the guy who hits up on it and adds a little bit of loft, he can actually afford to go down in loft a little bit more because he you know, has the right spin loft window. I just talked to a friend of mine, and he's concerned, you know, good player, but he hits up on it 7 degrees.
Oh, wow.
A lot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's borderline long drive angle of attack. So really good for getting lots of distance. Sometimes not always the best for consistency.
Yeah.
But he was trying to kind of balance out that angle of attack versus the dynamic loft. So you know, he was just asking, okay, if my angle of attack is +7, what does my dynamic loft need to be to have a balanced ball flight?
Right.
So you know, he's obviously going to launch it high because launch angle's coming out around 80% of dynamic loft.
Okay.
So there's your plane, there's your spin loft plane. So the ball will launch under the dynamic loft measurement. So like, you know, he's about 20 degrees of dynamic loft. So he's going to launch at 80% of that.
Yeah.
So he'll be around that 16 degrees of launch. So it's balancing all these things out. So don't want to take it to a too complicated
No, of course,
place.
but that's the conversation. I mean, people have to understand that spin loft is like, and even since I've been here working with you guys and hitting some shots, that's the #1 thing that I've taken away is spin loft is what produces your launch and spin numbers.
Absolutely.
And so getting back to the shots that we hit, is that 10.5 degree, you know, is that in the optimal zone? Is that about as good a fit as we're going to get for something like that?
It's pretty close.
Yeah.
If we're looking at sort of ideal numbers, the 27 degrees of 2,700 RPMs of backspin's a fraction high.
It's high. Okay.
I'd like to see it around 2,300.
Gotcha.
At 152, if you were launching it around 13 to 14, somewhere around about there is good.
Yep.
If you were spinning that around 2,300, your ball flight would come out about 105 feet.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Get a little bit more distance.
Get a little bit more distance, and that's about, you know, be about 100 to 105 miles an hour. Club head speed would produce about that 152 ball speed.
Yes.
So, you know, we know that that's a nice window for a nice balanced ball flight.
Gotcha.
Something that you can bring down in the wind, something you can lift up if you get a little downwind and you want to, you know, hit a long one that carries a long way.
So a very balanced, versatile ball flight that you can use. Yeah.
Nice balanced flight is exactly. We don't like to go to the extreme either way, high or low.
And that's kind of what we've illustrated are those extremes. And then, you know, in a fit, we take that 10.5 right now, we dial that down maybe with a shaft change.
Exactly.
And we bring that down 400 points and you'd be off. Last thing I wanted to ask, we looked at the club head speed numbers. They were all pretty much the same from the 3 clubs. And I had a question about why you thought the 10.5 was a couple miles an hour faster, and you had actually a pretty interesting answer for that.
Yeah, again, it actually comes down to spin loft. Another term for spin loft is compression. So if you have the right amount of spin loft, then you're actually, so with a driver, ideal is around 11 to 12 degrees of spin loft. That is going to produce the right amount of compression.
Gotcha.
So when you're using a higher lofted driver, it's no different from the reason we produce more ball speed on a 7-iron than we do on a pitching wedge.
Okay.
It has less loft.
So it's more of a glancing shot than a compressed shot.
The more square we can make that impact, the more energy we will produce from one object to another.
Yeah,
so when you increase in loft, if that spin loft window increases a little higher than we want, we won't just increase spin, we will lose ball speed.
I think that's not something I knew at all. So not only could you could pick the wrong loft and lose yards from the wrong launch and spin, you'd actually be losing ball speed too.
For sure.
So you could be really losing
lose
out.
2 ways.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, this was a bit of an eye opener for sure.
Good. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. As I say, this is prime time for you guys to be looking at all the new products.
Yep.
We want to just make sure you're educated and making the right decisions out there. But as always, get fit. Don't leave these things to chance. Golf clubs are expensive at any level, whether it's off the shelf or in a custom shop. So don't be making, you know, silly mistakes and guessing at this stuff. Use, you know, the right equipment. Use guys like ourselves, knowledgeable fitters, and you'll make the right choice. And the driver will save you money in the long term by not having to buy more in the future.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, very good
stuff. Thanks, guys.